Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Vu, and before I get into what I'm talking about today, I would like to ask you, the audience, some questions to think about throughout this podcast. Look back on your life, and no matter how old or young you are, try remembering your childhood. Now think about the people who raised you, and how you think they raised you. Strict? A bunch of rules you had to follow? Or did you have all the freedom you ever wanted? Now finally think about what would happen if they raised you differently and what kind of person you would be now. That is what I will be talking about today. How parents' roles in their child's lives can affect them in the future. Almost everyone has a parent figure in their lives and relied on them from time to time throughout their childhood. For me, my parents were very strict. They had a lot of rules I had to abide by, and they didn't let me do anything outside of school. There is this saying about how strict parents raise sneaky kids, and when I look back on it, I kind of feel some truth with that statement. With the strict parents that raised me in that kind of environment, when growing up, I learned to ignore rules set upon by my parents, to seek social interactions with my friends, and have a fun time during the later years of my childhood. Well, that's a little bit about me now. I want to dive deep into some science behind a child's development and how parents interacting with their children, good or bad, can affect their development. I found an article published in 2022 in the Developmental Review Journal about examining the roles of parents and teachers in executive function development in the early to middle years of childhood, made by Sumay Kuskulu-Sankar with their co-authors who are all from Writ University and specialize in behavioral sciences and youth development. In this article, they talk about something called executive functions, EF for an abbreviated version. And executive functions, as they describe it, are a highly valued thinking process that allows you to control your actions, emotions, and thoughts. They talk about how EF development links well with the social interactions between parent and child. These developments can show up in the first year of a child's life. For example, some things that may emerge are control of attention and self-regulation. Interactions with parents can help a child learn the basics like knowing whether what they are doing is right or wrong. It will help them be able to begin thinking for themselves already. I also want to bring another source that I found, which was made back in 2021. By a professor from the University of California, Yuko Munakata, who specializes in the Department of Psychology. She begins to talk about how there are many factors to take into account when you are trying to determine how a child will end up in the future. And it is like predicting a hurricane from a flap of a butterfly's wing. Later in the TED Talk, Yuko begins to explain how not every child is the same. For example, divorce could mean bad news for the oldest child, but relief for the youngest. Your parenting can lead to the oldest hating you and the youngest loving you. This brings up a good point on how you can't have the same parenting with all of your children, because if it works for one child, doesn't mean it'll work for the others. So what can we take away from these sources? Parents have a big influence on the thinking skills of children, and parents have to always adjust their roles to their children to make them become the best they can. With that being said, we now know how important parenting is. Now I want to ask everyone some more questions to think about. When you think back on your life, do you remember having a bad interaction with your parents? Did your parents argue a lot? Then, if you can remember, what were your feelings or emotions at that time? In this next segment, I would like to talk about what can happen when parents have a sort of negative influence on their children, and how these negative influence can be something as simple as parents arguing with each other. Everyone has bad moments, right? Might be the amount of stress coming from work or school, and with all that built up stress, you might feel like you might burst if you don't let it out. Don't worry, because I have experienced something like this, a burst of anger because I couldn't hold in whatever was happening with my surroundings. There was this time in my life when I couldn't take criticism from my parents anymore, so with the anger that came out, I harmed the relationship I had with my parents. Now think about your parents and how they have to go to work every day and get tired, but still have to tend to the housework and pay the bills. You can see what I'm getting at, right? Parents have a lot of responsibilities, and with that, a lot of built-in stress. So at times, parents can have a sudden outburst, and it's not their fault. I found a source made by Fiona Douglas, and it talks in the video called "How Did Your Parents Mess You Up?" made in 2018. Fiona talks about the lasting effects parents can leave on their children by saying something negative out of an outburst of emotion or anger. Let's bring in another source made by Nicolene Peck, who is a professional when it comes to parenting and has made much literature regarding this topic. In this video made in 2021, Peck talks about how parents arguing with each other can affect their children. This can include a sort of detachment from parents, to taking sides, lying habits being picked up, and even developing bad behavioral habits, because growing up at home isn't a good environment for children. Now, if all this can happen from just arguing, imagine something much worse that parents do that can negatively affect their children. Now I want to ask you guys, was there anything your parents did or have said to you that you wish they never did? How did you feel about it then? And when you think back, how do you feel about it now? The scars you get from childhood cut deep within you and can shape your future. Even the best parents have these kinds of flaws in their parenting skills, and because of those flaws in all of the parents, it can cause children to develop traumas for a variety of different things. Now that we just wrapped up talking about the effects of parenting on children, I would like to go into more detail about some personal experiences I've had in my story with my parents and compare them with my friend's childhood experience. Where my story plays into this is that I didn't think my parents were necessarily good, but they weren't the worst parents. Like I mentioned at the beginning, they were very strict parents with a lot of rules. With those rules, my childhood had barely any social interactions with anybody. I would like to say this was the reason why I became mature very quickly, because I never got to act like a kid. Now, I want to bring up a conversation that I had with a childhood friend about this topic. His name is Tyler Wood, and we have known each other since elementary school. The reason why I think this conversation is relevant is that I can show you a comparison between our childhood and show you how different our parents were and how both our personalities were different because of it. What we first talked about is how he was raised by his parents, and he talked about how he had no restrictions as a kid, no rules that he had to follow, which was completely opposite from me. Then when I asked him what he thought about how that affected him, he answered that because he didn't have any restrictions, he was able to go out and socialize with people a lot more. So naturally, he became an outgoing person that likes to socialize. On the other hand, I didn't get to socialize with people at all because of the strict rules. This leads me to have a sort of social anxiety when meeting or talking to new people. With that, I became introverted, of course, since I wasn't able to go out as much, and my friend became extroverted. So with my parents being so strict, it made me, when I was more of a teenager, striving to gain some freedom, and that leads to being a sneaky kid and doing things my parents would not know. This is a very specific example of the effects of strict parents have on children's development. Now, I want to show you a broader scope of the effects of authoritative parenting, instead of the specific effects that it did to me. I found an article that is more credible, published by Anita Fayante with her co-authors, titled "Is Authoritative Parenting the Best Parenting Style?" made in 2021. This source talks about authoritative parenting and goes into the effects it has on children. For example, strict parenting can help their children from having behavioral problems and perform better in school. But because of the parents' cold or psychological control over their children, the children can develop internalizing mental health problems like anxiety and depression. And because of the strict parenting, the children would be more hesitant when voicing out their concerns. I would know because I lived in that environment. After talking about my personal experiences, I would like to try to conclude this by talking more about what I think about parenting. First, I would like to say that parenting is hard, and everyone should know that. It should be the people who acknowledge that it is hard, but still would like to strive and become good parents to have kids. I would say that too much love and spoiling your kid can act like a sort of poison for your child when they grow into an adult. But neglecting your child or having to be strict with rules or boundaries can lead to even worse life. Like everything in life, there is a balance point, and for parenting, the balance point varies from family to family. It should be the job of parents to find a way to balance out their roles so that their child can grow up to be the best person they can ever be. Well, thank you all for listening to this podcast. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you all take away something from this podcast. Goodbye.